Okay, I'm going to end up sounding like the kid who's presenting last because I am, and I could just be like what they said, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to work through. I'm going to work through something that I've talked to some colleagues about. But before that, I'd like to thank, first of all, the committee and everyone for being here and listening. And I'd also like to thank my chair, Carolyn Lesjak, for her support on nominating me and all the work she had to do for that, as well as my students and my undergrads and graduate students who I know supported my nomination. I was going to start in a very English professorial way and introduce this, what the pandemic has done to teaching, by talking about Walter Benjamin's idea of the aura, this thing that you can only know exists when it starts to disappear. But instead, as a newly minted Canadian teaching in Canada, I should cite Canadian luminary Joni Mitchell and say, you don't know what you got till it's gone. And that thing that's gone is an important duo in literary studies. And this is something that my colleague, Nikki Didicher, told me that was confusing and obtuse. And so, of course, I'm sticking with it. That duo is form and content, because I think that the losses of pandemic teaching really foregrounded some of the issues around form and content in the classroom. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. One of the key lessons in literary studies is this relationship between form and content, and in fact that they are inseparable. When I teach a Shakespearean sonnet, there's 14 lines, there's a certain rhyme scheme, there's a certain rhythm, that is form. And then when we read the actual sonnet, we see in it language, images and emotions and affect and feeling. And what happens there is that's the content. And one of the things that you can't have one without the other, that they are inseparable, that they are part and parcel with each other. So as a medievalist, I'm teaching like Emily, I'm teaching old stuff that's, from a very different world, a very different time. And so I'm deeply committed to all of that historical context, dates, places, movements, Christian doctrine, aesthetic changes, all these big content issues, right? But the thing that the pandemic has brought and made clear is that we lose a lot of form. And when I'm talking about form, I'm talking about debate and empathy and care, about interpretation, about listening, about jokes, about friendships, all of the things that sort of start to vanish when we move to these online formats. And so, in a way, like some of the others, the pandemic was a kind of gift, because it made me really focus on those losses and how they impact my teaching. So that is so the form and content can be understood in terms of the what and the how, right? The what is the material content, that is to say, the social and cultural worlds of medieval England in the year 800, or verbs that I have to teach them in Old English. But what I miss then is the how, this room full of selves where I can see body language, where I can hear tonal inflections, where I can see how people are interacting. I mean, it's, despite the wonders of technology, right? And this is remarkable. Here I am talking to 40 whatever people, but I'm in my office by myself. But I also, there's a lot that's lost. Like, I don't know how everyone's reacting. I can't tell how hilarious you think my jokes are. I'm just going to pretend that you think they're hilarious. The point being that we've lost something, and I wanted to try to recuperate that. I wanted to work on the how. And that how then, even before the pandemic really started, but over the course of the last, 3 terms, I guess, 18 months of teaching, has shifted to integrate this form and content question. And I thought one way of being effective would be to sort of merge them really holistically. And to do that was to foster a collaborative community of sort of critical and creative readers and thinkers. And this shift made my teaching over the last 6 terms much more effective, but also affective. It was responsive, I think, to the losses of the pandemic, and it really sought to recuperate some of the human engagement so central to a humanities education. And I was just going to talk about 3 hot tips for how I tried to do this in my classrooms in various size classrooms. So this is like the little nuts and bolts part of creating these little communities. In my undergraduate courses, and I'm only going to talk about undergrad stuff today, I built in 3 elements to try to foster these kinds of communities, this cooperative and inclusive environment for learning, and places, and to make the classroom a place where this form, the kind of social connections we can make, the way that we can debate with each other when we're live and in person, the connections we make to other people in the room as fellow readers and scholars. I wanted that stuff to come to the fore. And so one of the things I did was, along with each week's reading, I assigned very low stakes, informal sort of responses. These were like gut reactions to particular moments, answers to focused critical questions, interpretations of an image or a scene. And what these did was that by having these prepared, the students came to class ready to go. They came to class with a shared, common ground intellectually. They had something to talk about, so we could get into stuff right away. Everyone already had a take on Allison's joyous tee and say the Miller's Tale, or they all had an idea about the sort of bizarre, surreal, gender fluid talking deer in Marie de France's Guy-Jamard, right? So what we could do is then work from those and talk through questions, lines of inquiry, different kinds of interpretations, and share our ideas about these things, because these are the very forms that are very much part and parcel of Chaucer's evocation of female desire, or Marie de France's medieval symbolism. Now, second thing I did, I had students take non-traditional approaches to texts. And this is where you're really going to miss the slides. I promise you, they were awesome. I had my students' permission to show some of the stuff they did, but I had, in a class on Old English literature, I had them close read the passages that describe the monster Grendel in Beowulf, and then use those close readings, those details from the text, to draw a picture of the monster. Now, what was amazing was that they were like, it was like they were drawing hundreds of different things, right? Some of the monsters were like these shaggy, toothy, Bigfoot-like things, and some of them were like these little shadowy, spooky ghosts, very Halloween. And this panoply, the vast range of these things allowed us to have a broader conversation about the way the poem reflects on fear, the way it understands evil as amorphous and changing and protean. In another class on medieval British women's writing, I had my students translate authors onto social media. So for instance, I had one of my students made a Tinder account for Marjorie Kemp, the early 15th century mystic. And the way that he had her sort of tweak the conventions of Tinder really exposed how Marjorie Kemp uses the language of sexual love, of erotic desire, to claim power, to create a certain kind of space for her own subjectivity. It was hilarious too. That was the other thing, is that the students, when they shared these things, they could laugh together, they could talk to each other, they could admire each other's work. I was like aiming to create this community that could both debate the big questions and topics, but also have fun, meet each other, get to know each other. And finally, third, and this is the last thing and then I'll be done, were the in-class activities where my students' knowledge of the material and each other came together. So for instance, I assigned in a Chaucer class a debate, right? I split them into 2 camps. They had to debate whether or not the universe of Chaucer's Knight's Tale was just. And in another class, I had them break into breakout rooms and do linguistic research on early Middle English vocabulary and the ways that these particular words are powerful in their construction of gender. So what this did, and then they had to present on these words and make a case for what these words' effect were in the text, so that these activities They were often, I will admit right away, chaotic, unruly, boisterous, loud, but they were also really lovely. They were gorgeous as the students came together around sort of big ideas, new lines of inquiry. They worked together on these ideas, issues, and topics. And these little interactive, engaged micro communities, they explored philosophical crises, historical language use, identity formation, critical argumentation, and when they worked best, they really made clear the unity of pedagogical form and content. And they also forged, social and personal connections among us. I get to see these students together again in later classes because they keep coming back. It's been really great. So that's my form and content reflection, some exercises to generate it. Thanks very much to everyone again.